We're going to look at a second one of Mr. Bacon's essays. Really hard to choose from one of them, quite truthfully. I'm going to look at one called Of Wisdom for a Man's Self. This is the one that I'm going to focus on. It cites the ant at the beginning, and I just wanted to briefly reflect on Scripture's reference to ants. In the ancient world, there was often, especially amongst the Romans, a great love of reference to the bee as a model of social order, industriousness, the honey that would be produced, the willingness to defend the hive, all that sort of stuff. So the Romans regularly appealed to the bee. We don't see that in Scripture so much, but we do see reference to the honey in Proverbs, which is wisdom literature, and that will be relevant here. So in Proverbs 6, verse 6, "Go to the ant, O sluggard, consider her ways and be wise. Without having any chief, officer, or ruler, she prepares her bread in summer and gathers her food in harvest. How long will you lie there, O sluggard? When will you arise from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man." So wisdom here is a practical industriousness. There's not an immediate consequences to your actions, but the result of it is going to come inevitably from a lack of industry on your part. So the ant then as a figure of wisdom for being industrious, doing his day's work, an honest day's work, I guess, for an ant. Never stops doing that. Proverbs 30, "Four things on earth are small, yet they are exceedingly wise. The ants are creatures of little strength, yet they store up their food in the summer in order to tough it out over the course of the winter." They never stop working in the summer. You see them constantly. Rock badgers, because they make their home in rocks. Locusts, all advance in formation. They hold the line. And finally, the lizard, you can catch one, but they're found in the palaces of kings. So there's something wise about the lizard even in that sense. We're not interested in that per se. We're going to look at essays, Don's essays here, and this one in particular. The 23rd. And this one is called Of Wisdom for a Man's Self. It's, I thought it was rather apropos because we live in an age of great narcissism. And I would say encouraged onto us furthermore as the path of success. And this is very much an essay against egotism or even sociopaths or narcissists. Narcissism is a feature of most politicians, most entertainers. It's rewarded when people preen in public and advance their self-interest, and we are interested in these influencers. So this is Of Wisdom for a Man's Self, and he begins with the idea of an ant. Let me read it. It's a very brief one, and then we'll reflect on it in light of what we said earlier about the way in which Bacon structures his arguments in a Ciceronian periodic style. So an ant is a wise creature for itself, but it is a shrewd thing in an orchard or garden. And certainly men that are great lovers of themselves waste the public. Divide with reason between self-love and society, and be so true to thyself as thou be not false to others, especially to thy king and country. Polonius's advice to his son Hamlet is, to thy own self be true, and you cannot be to any man false. That's the advice of a king to a prince. It's not advice for every man. It's the advice of, if a king acts in the king's interests and acts like a good king, then the whole body politic benefits. If individuals act in their own self-interest, it destroys the public good. Self-identifying what your self-interest is is a recipe for common ruin. So divide with reason between self-love and society. Be so true to thyself as thou be not false to others, especially to thy king and country. It is a poor center of man's actions. Himself, it is right earth, for that only stands fast upon its own center, whereas all things that have affinity with the heavens move upon the center of another, which they benefit. The greatest love of all is not loving yourself. It's a Whitney Houston song from the 80s, right? And promoted regularly. You have to love yourself first. In pop culture, pop psychology, you have to learn to love yourself. And then it's the basis for all other loves. The Maslow's hierarchy of human needs puts the self at the center of all higher loves. You have to love yourself first, and then God's love comes upon that. That's not Christian theology. It's not sound counsel at all. You know what I'm talking about, Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. Self-actualization comes at the top of all of that. It's all self. The referring of all to a man's self is more tolerable in a sovereign prince. That doesn't mean it's right, but it's more tolerable, because themselves are not only themselves, but their good and evil is at the peril of the public fortune. So that they have two bodies. I talked about this when I taught Shakespeare to some of you. The king has a physical body, but he also represents the body politic. So the king ought to consider his country's good ahead of his own private good, because they're connected. And the king is dead, long live the king, because the monarchy is he's the head of the whole kingdom. He says, so it's tolerable in a sovereign prince, but it is a desperate evil in a servant to a prince or a citizen in a republic. For whatsoever affairs pass such a man's hands, he crooketh them to his own ends, which must needs be often eccentric to the ends of his master or state. So he's pursuing a selfish good, which is at odds with the public good, until there's no public good left. We're all preying off the public currency, which we all depend upon, until we've debased the currency to the point where there's no gold left. Therefore, let princes or states choose such servants as have not this mark, except they mean their service should be made but the accessory. That which maketh the effect more pernicious is that all proportion is lost. And note this Ciceronian emphasis on proportion. Comparison, relationship, which is a part of the old cosmology as the Elizabethan worldview. Proportion, order, symmetry. My good at the expense of all others' good is not a good at all. It's an evil. My good in relation to others' good, that's a balanced one you have to consider. Well, what's the highest and greatest good? Then you relate everything to that. But if self-love is the ultimate valuation of good, then there is no public good left at all. The 19th century will go full in this direction. Walt Whitman will write a poem called Song to Myself. All proportion is lost. If it were disproportion enough for the servant's good to be preferred before the master's. But yet it is a greater extreme when a little good of the servant shall carry things against a greater good of the master's. And when he says the master's here, of course he is thinking of the king, but obviously any Christian is also going to be thinking about the love of God and the good of God's good. And yet that is the case of bad officers, treasurers, ambassadors, generals, and other false and corrupt servants, which set a bias upon their bowl of their own petty ends and envies to the overthrow of their master's great and important affairs. So they act out of self-interest. I'm an ambassador for Canada, but I act there to make a living for myself, and not for the good of the country I represent. I'm just using that as an illustration. Get any. And for the most part, the good such servants receive is after the model of their own fortune. They get richer. If they're in public office and they get a certain amount of money and they retire as multimillionaires, you can tell that they're bad servants. It's the tell right away. But the hurt they sell for that good is after the model of their master's fortune. And certainly it is the nature of extreme self-lovers, as they will set an house on fire, and it were but to roast their eggs. And yet these men many times hold credit with their masters, because their study is but to please them and profit themselves. So bad servants are there because they flatter their masters and serve their own self-interest. So they're self-regarding in everything, and their self-regard is particularly evident in the fact that they will flatter rather than do the master's good. They will act as if they care above no thing more than their master's good, even while pursuing their selfish interests. For either respect, they will abandon the good of their affairs. Finally, this: wisdom for a man's self is, in many branches thereof, a depraved thing. It is the wisdom of rats, that they will be sure to leave a house somewhat before it fall. It is wisdom of the fox that thrusts out the badger, who digged and made room for him. It is the wisdom of crocodiles that shed tears when they would devour. But that which is specially to be noted is that those which, as Cicero says of Pompey, are sui amantes sine rivale, lovers of themselves without rival, are many times unfortunate. And whereas they have all their times sacrificed to themselves, they become in the end themselves sacrifices to the inconstancy of fortune, whose wings they thought by their self-wisdom to have pinioned. So the person that acts in self-interest ends up often falling, because his sense of self-interest was not wise enough to see ahead to what was coming. And in general, he presents them as grifters who are going to do well in the house but don't look after the house, and then they'll flee the house just before the house falls, just like a rat. Or they will take over someone's house like a fox that pushes out the badger, or they'll be like crocodiles that will shed tears as if they were feeling sorry when really that was part of them swallowing up. So illustrations of the self-lover and someone who doesn't care for the public good. Now, a public servant who has these characteristics will be particularly pernicious. Anyway, it's on what? Wisdom for a man's self. So wisdom separated from the common good, from relationship, it's an autonomous self. This becomes, I would say, the Enlightenment model of self-good. Autonomy. Seize the day for yourself. The worst of the Italian Renaissance was not as bad as our day in this sense. People are extraordinarily self-regarding. They do not consider the good of the public or of others. They don't love God above all, and they don't love their neighbor as themselves. They love themselves first. It's not the foundation. Jesus nowhere teaches that we're to love ourselves. Nowhere. By loving God and loving our neighbor, we do love ourselves. Because you're recognizing something of yourself in that self-giving love that Christ himself models. So anyway, this is Bacon's reflection. Note that the threefold comparison there at the end. I would love to go on to look at innovations, and all the essays are worth reading. Very dense. The variety is infinite. He teaches people how to live as well as how to think. And I would say what is particularly noteworthy about the essays is that almost every line is poetic in character. You know, the lines themselves are memorable, as if they were taken from poems. So dense, comparative, relational quality. It's a great model for writing. But it takes time. Like he's got He started with how many essays? I think something like 16 or something like that. I've got it in my notes here somewhere. And eventually expanded it to 30 something and ended up with 58 after, when they finally got published in the third edition in 1625. He spent a lot of time thinking and condensing the thoughts so they came out in the form they are. And they're pretty brief, pithy, and still worth reading. And they've never gone out of print, which is pretty significant observation of the worth of any work, is that it stays in print. It's that popular. It's held to be of that value. Any comments? Sorry, I've shifted on here. Mr. Bacon's Of Wisdom for Man's Self. Any questions or comments? I'm not reflecting on any particular figure with this. You might have had one in mind immediately, but I can tell you that it would apply to almost any number of people you could think of. And that's considered to be wisdom. Well, but it's the wisdom of the fox, because foxes are canny. They know how to get things done for themselves and manage to play things so that it plays out so they can stay in their positions. But actually, not the fox in the hen house. It's the fox occupying the badger's dwelling, and the badger hollowed it out, dug it out, created the. It seems our world is living on the fumes of other great people's actions until it's hollowed out, and we're getting sucking out the last goodness out of it, and then nothing will be left. It's like currency fraud, civilizational currency fraud. Okay. Surely it's